The last thing to consider is the relationship of sociology to other areas of study. For example, consider it in light of history. Perhaps the way to contrast sociology with history is to look at the way it judges or evaluates things. History may tend to look at isolated phenomena and study it. So, as the author suggests, look at a Mussolini during the 1940s and a Hitler and chart or compare these two in terms of their ascension to power and how they reacted to certain similar situations. Sociology will look at the broader context, such as the circumstances which led to the phenomena that, or the conditions that allowed a phenomena like a Hitler to come into place. For example, it's generally understood that the conditions under which Germany agreed to stop fighting after World War I were so onerous that for the decade or 15 years thereafter, when basically Germany's economy was in sad shape, the population became so demoralized that an opportunist like a Hitler could take advantage of things and therefore begin his rise to power. And that many of the Germans may end up feeling so dispirited that, crazy though Hitler's goals might have been, at least he suggested a way out of the kind of misery that they experienced. Sociology, if it were to compare things, might look at the circumstances that ended up producing that phenomena. So look at the conditions under which Italy operated, primarily because of the difficulties of the Great Depression, and how that sense of despair might have led to someone like a Mussolini. Another area of science that may be rather similar to sociology would be anthropology, where there's a greater emphasis on, if you will, a tribalism. Even as it is, you might find that anthropology is broken into two camps. One, physical anthropologists, who are more like biologists than sociologists, who look at the ways of the individuals leading to certain outcomes, and then the cultural anthropologists, who are looking at people and the way in which they end up in comparison to one another, much more like sociologists. So you might find more of an overlap between the cultural anthropologists and sociologists. If you look over in the biological sciences, you'll find things that are more focused on the micro level than necessarily the macro level. So at the micro level, you're looking at these kinds of individual differences. Take, for example, the idea of XYY chromosomes. In the 1970s, there was an effort to look at chromosomes as potentially accounting for criminal behavior. In that criminal behavior, we found that some men ended up having an extra Y chromosome, if you will, that the Y chromosome on the 23rd pair of genes would help to determine sex, and that having an extra Y chromosome, which was somewhat unusual, would mean that we'd have individuals who are more aggressive and therefore more likely to be criminals. And while it turned out to be true that we'd find that in people who were in prison, the men tended to have more of this occurrence of the XYY chromosome, you wouldn't be able to find under that population so many of them that would reasonably account for why they engaged in criminal behavior. You would also have the situation that you would find these people in general population and they weren't necessarily committing crimes, however you wanted to look at it. So biologists might want to look at something like a genetic difference to account for things, and some sociologists would be interested in that too, but that ends up failing, at least when trying to account for criminal behavior. Psychology might be, of the bunch, the area of study that might be closest to sociology, although I think cultural anthropology is probably the closest. But psychology is like biology as well. It has a tendency to look at the micro level rather than the larger scale macro level, so that psychology will look at the psyche, the mind of an individual, rather than necessarily looking at the contexts that lead individuals to create such things. So you'll find the theory in sociology of something called anomie. And what anomie says is that you have an environment where there is such a breakdown of a functioning society that really people feel like they don't have to operate by any societal rules. Of the remaining cousins or areas of study that are similar to sociology, the author mentions economics and political science. In the respect that sociology is like economics, it's that they share an interest in qualitative data, although to be honest, that's something that you'll also find of concern with psychology, biology, and the last one we'll talk about, political science as well, because you're going to be looking to having data on such a scale as to be able to understand better a certain outcome. But economics seems to talk about much more the concerns of the data rather than necessarily what it means, while sociology may reverse that. It'll be interested in the data, but it'll be doing so from the perspective of the theory first. Political science also may be having an interest in using data, but political science may arguably be a subset of sociology, since political science is focusing on power. And if you think back a little bit, that's pretty much what we saw as the concern with Marx's conflict theory. Who's got the power and how are they going to end up using it? Finally, the author talks about divisions within sociology. So we see concepts that we had talked about before, for example, interpretive sociology and positivist sociology, where at least both put an emphasis on some sort of scientific approach towards dealing with things, but nonetheless they may end up differing on what do you do with the consequences. The last division that the author talks about is macro-sociological versus micro-sociological, and so we're talking a difference of scale. Think back to the example of the Chicago school, and the particular example that I talked about when they looked at the patterns of distribution of people around Chicago, that you saw that closer to the center of the city you'd have the newer immigrants, people who could not afford some of the better quality housing, but as they accumulated capital, they would spread out from the center, being able to afford better quality properties. That tends to be a micro-sociological phenomena, although you might see macro-sociological on a much higher scale, looking at it from other cities, for example, as well as Chicago. So this is something of a overview of Chapter 1. With any luck, you'll have heard certain kinds of things here that'll help you to understand the material, at least in terms of being able to complete the group assignments that I've asked you to complete. As always, if there's something that doesn't seem clear to you, please bring it up in class. There's a decent chance that if you end up raising this point, and it's something that I haven't done a good job with explaining, your classmates will probably also be unsure about it. So there'd be a benefit to them to be able to hear the answers from this. Otherwise, I'll next speak to you regarding material from Chapter 2.